Good day, students. My name is Dr. Kayode Kofoworola, and I'll be taking a session from our course ENG 115, which is Practical Criticism. Today, we will be looking at the topic Practical Criticism itself. We want to understand what is practical criticism, how do we engage in it, and what do we look out for when we engage in practical criticism. Practical criticism emerged in the early 1920s with the work of I.A. Richards. I.A. Richards experimented with certain poems in order to enable students find in those poems for themselves a practical application of the content of the poems to their own psychological well-being. So practical criticism, unlike what we know generally about what criticism is not just simply being critical or looking for faults. It is a holistic approach towards enjoying and ultimately analyzing a work of art. Practical criticism developed along this strain and was carried on further by one of the students of I.A. Richards, known as William Epson, where he wrote a book on the Seven Ambiguities. And in discussing the Seven Ambiguities, Epson was concerned with the approaches that students will have to take when they engage a poem. So in discussing practical criticism, we must ask ourselves questions such as, what do I look out for in a work of art when I read a work of art? In addition, William Epson, one of I.A. Richards' students, wrote 7 types of ambiguity, in which he developed from his undergraduate essays for Richards a study of complex and multiple meanings of poems. This critical work by William Epson impacted the critical movement of that time and led to the emergence of what today we know as New Criticism. And New Criticism sees poems as elaborate structures of complex meanings. The poems are not just ordinary words, they are elaborate structures of complex meanings. The result is that new critics pay little attention to historical settings of the works they analyze, but rather they treat literature as an independent sphere of activity. Also, the critic known as F.R. Lewis, in his close analysis, considered that practical criticism is a moral activity in which a critic uses his entire sensibility to bear on a text, and in the process tests its sincerity and moral seriousness. These critics that we have studied, that we have mentioned, I.A. Richards, William Epson, and F.R. Lewis, were the foundation of what today we know as practical criticism. It is, however, important to mention that practical criticism today, as it is treated, has become an ancillary skill, not a foundational critical method as it was in the beginning with these critics that we have mentioned. Part of many exams or examinations in literature that we write today are used to test students' responsiveness to what they read, knowledge of verse forms, and technical language. So when we test students in practical criticism today, unlike in the earlier terms, we are concerned with what are you reading? What are the knowledge of verse form that you are gaining from what you have read? And what are the technical language that is in those verse forms. So we use that to describe the way poems create effect. A knowledge of reading, a knowledge of verse forms and technical language is what helps us to describe the effect that poems create for us. Inadvertently then, practical criticism in this form has no necessary connection with any particular theoretical approach and has thus shared the psychological theories which originally underpinned it. The discipline today, however, has some ground rules which affect how people who are trained in it will respond to literature. For instance, we want to see how encouraging readings which concentrate on the form and meaning of particular works rather than on larger theoretical questions influence the interpretation. So you will find that in reading a poem, for instance, we want to see how when you read the poems and concentrate on the form and the meaning of the particular poems, you are able to have a feel of what the poem is saying, rather than focusing on theoretical questions and foundations. And finally, the process of reading a poem in isolation from historical processes, in isolation from a sphere of other activities such as economic or social conditions, and even in isolation from the life of its author. What do we mean by this? We mean that a poem or a work of art has a life of its own. So when we read a poem or a work of art, we should be reading it as a text with a life of its own, rather than as a collocation or a correlation of what is happening outside of the text, either in the author's life or in the economic or social conditions that guide the writing of the text. I believe that at the end of this lesson, you have learned what practical criticism is, and you have been enabled to provide an historical explanation for the origin of practical criticism. In addition, you have also learned what it entails to engage a particular writing, work of art, or poem in order to elicit meaning from it. Thank you.